Often maligned figures at Manchester United, both Fred and Scott McTominay have come in for more than a little bit of criticism over the past few years. But since Rangnick has come in as the manager of Manchester United, both Fred and McTominay have received a lot of praise from the German. But are they good enough for Man United? And can they excel under Rangnick's system? Let's find out. Right, then the first thing we need to do with Scott McTominay and Fred, and it's something that people don't tend to do, and that is separate them. They're not the same player. They're not one player. It's like they go out there as some conjoined twin called McFred, and everything one does, the other one does as well. Often, the criticism of one will be thrown at the other. The praise of one will be given to the other. So when one player's having a good game, one player's having a bad game, they end up both being credited with this sort of average at best type performance, which I think has been unfair at different times on both of them. So let's split them into two, and let's start with Fred. Now, when you look at Ralph Rangnick's system, Fred makes a lot of sense. When you look at his pressures, which is something that Rangnick has basically, brought to modern attention in football, he ranks in the 94th percentile of midfielders, which basically means he's one of the best pressing midfielders in Europe. Other things like tackles, interceptions and blocks, he is far better than average on all of them. And in blocks, he's in the 98th percentile, which means if you're having a shot, he's going to be there. These are all brilliant things that we can see when we watch Fred play. That's the thing with him. You see everything about him. He's not one of those players that goes under the radar. He's not a Michael Carrick player where actually it's his positioning that's brilliant, or actually it's his ability to read the game that's brilliant. You see the best of Fred and the worst of Fred every single time he plays because he's such an obvious player. So blocks, he's always there. Interceptions, tackles, pressures, we know he's good at those things. But then you look at things like, touches. When you look at progressive passes received, he's far worse than average in all of those. And when it comes to dribbles completed, he's only in the 33rd percentile, which means 66% of midfielders are better than him. And where this becomes a problem, when you look at those dribbles, is because he's not the best passer of the ball. And whilst he has a decently high pass percentage, that's because a lot of his passes are going sideways or to short people in and around him. We know from watching Fred, he's not a great passer of the ball. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't have the ability to bring the ball out with his feet either. And that's why sometimes he can be pressed and he can lose the ball. We saw it last season multiple times. We saw it against Wolves. We saw it against Leicester. We saw him giving the ball away due to a mixture of not being able to bring the ball out from the back by dribbling and not be able to pass his way out of trouble. It's a big problem that Fred has. We saw against Crystal Palace the best of Fred. He was brilliant in that first half, scored a goal in the second half, pressed well, intercepted well, did all of those things that make you think, you know what, Fred could be a top player in the system. But the problem is in the games following it, we saw against Newcastle where he was taken off at half-time. We saw against Norwich where he was very poor. We see these games from him where his best traits aren't allowed to shine. His interceptions, his blocks, his tackles, his pressures aren't allowed to shine. And instead, he has to rely occasionally on his passing ability, his ability to bring the ball out from the back, his ability to find space and turn and expand play and bring the play forward. These are things he's poor at. He's below average at all of these things. And if you want to be a midfielder, even if it's a defensive, deep line midfielder where most of the emphasis is on off-the-ball actions, if you want to be a midfielder for a top club, you have to be able to pass the ball. You have to be able to bring the ball out from the back occasionally. You have to be able to get in there and expand play and put the ball out to the wingers and put the ball out to the striker and occasionally chip the ball over the top when you've got two men pressing you and there's no other option. You still have to be able to put a decent ball in, and Fred just isn't capable of that. That's his biggest problem. He doesn't seem to be getting any better at those things. Whilst he's excellent, one of the best in Europe, as we said, at pressures, tackles, interceptions, blocks, all of these off-the-ball things, Rangnick said himself, off the ball, he's almost perfect at times. The problem is on the ball, he's so far below average that he can't ever overcome what are those weaknesses and take himself to being a top midfielder. He's also 28 years old, which means we are probably seeing just about the best version of Fred we're going to see. Maybe he'll get a little bit better as he approaches 30, but generally speaking, late 20s, he's in his peak. He's had a lot of game time, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. I don't think we're going to see a Fred that obviously doesn't have the passing range of Paul Scholes, but I don't think we'll see one with the passing range of Tom Cleverley or Darren Gibson or one of those players who can find a 30, 40-yard pass occasionally. We're going to see a very similar Fred to what we see now, and I just worry the limitations are too limited. One thing to say about Fred before we move on, and it should be a basic, it should be a given with any professional footballer, any sportsman, pretty much anyone in the world. he gives his all every single time. And it's worth mentioning because, yes, it's one of those, of course he does, he gets paid 150 grand a week, whatever he gets paid. We've seen a lot in the last few weeks of Manchester United, the last months, the last season basically of Manchester United, where the players, you are questioning their dedication, their effort, their application, their willingness to change, their willingness to learn, their willingness to sprint and try and work hard and get hurt. That's something you can never question with Fred. So I think all of the criticism or any criticism that we're giving or that people give, at least you can say about him, he tried his hardest in every game. And that isn't something you can say about everyone else. So he has to get credit for that. Now let's move on to Scott McTominay then, and he's someone that he's been getting a lot more praise recently. We saw in the early part of Rangnick's tenure, Fred looking great, Fred doing well, and he's dropped right off. Scott McTominay has almost gone the other way. Pretty much week in, week out, he has improved under Ralph Rangnick, bar a little bit of a blip against Wolves. And that improvement is almost a sort of zoomed in version of his career as a whole. I think he's someone that has improved massively over the last 3 or 4 years, from someone that you wouldn't trust his passing, you wouldn't trust his positioning, you wouldn't trust his ability to win the ball back, his size, his strength. You wouldn't trust those things 3 or 4 years ago. Now you can rely on him for almost all of those things. And I think whilst his passing range is still limited, we saw in the game the other day against Aston Villa, he is capable of those volleys out to Rashford, those slice balls out to the wing, those balls clipped over the top. He does have that in his locker. And that's something that if he can keep improving that, we may well see turn into a very reliable part of his game. Now let's look at a direct comparison with Fred then. So before we looked at Fred with his pressures, one of the best in the world in that position, Scott McTominay, well under average at that. His tackles again are around average for a player of his position, but this is where he excels. His interceptions, blocks, clearances, and crucially over Fred, his aerials won. So from set pieces, from goal kicks, when the ball's bouncing around in the middle of the park, he can win those balls because of his size. And it's one of the things that, unfortunately for Fred, he's not going to be able to improve on that. He's 5'7", he's 5'8", and that isn't going to change anytime soon. Scott McTominay is a big lad, and he just has that aerial presence, whether you like it or not. We saw it the other day against Aston Villa, winning that header in the box, winning us the game in the FA Cup. That's something he has in his locker. The other thing he has that Fred doesn't, whilst they're both quite limited in their passing range, although I think McTominay is better, McTominay can bring the ball out from the back. You look at dribbles completed, you look at progressive carries. He's above average in both of those stats. He's someone that can get the ball, look for a pass. If it's not on, he can take the ball forward himself, 20, 30, 40 yards. We saw it against Burnley, pushing people onto the floor, playing Cristiano Ronaldo through on goal. That's something that McTominay has added to his game. And when he's allowed to play in a slightly more loose role, a slightly more open role, he can bring that. And another thing he has that Fred doesn't have, and that most defensive midfielders don't have, he is a goal threat. He's above average in non-penalty goals. He's above average in non-penalty expected goals and shots for players in his position. We saw it the other day against Burnley where he scores the goal, tests the goalkeeper twice more from the edge of the 18-yard box. One of those tipped onto the post, bounces down, Ronaldo scores. That is directly contributing to Manchester United winning. Doesn't go down as an assist, but that shot from Scott McTominay forced the goalkeeper into letting a tap in for Ronaldo. And that's the thing with Scott McTominay that I like and that I think you have to give him credit for and you have to give him time to improve. He is improving. He has added things to his game. Those 7 goals last season, which, it's not a lot of goals, but contributing those goals from deep is something that's very impressive and can just change the tide of games. Making the defender question their decision because McTominay's over there and he's got a shot on him, that can change the thinking of a defender, leave space in other areas and allow Manchester United to score other goals. He has got threats in multiple areas and that's why I think he's worth sticking with. So what have we learned overall then? We've learned they are both limited players. They are both players that have quite rightly had plenty of criticism over the years. And they are both players that theoretically have traits that are very suited to Rangnick's systems. I think the difference for me is I'm not sure it's possible to create a system that isolates Fred's strengths enough to make up for his weaknesses. His weaknesses are too plenty and too obvious. He can't pass the ball out from the back. He can't bring the ball out from the back. And when he's pressed high and when he's pressured into situations where he has to use his weak foot or he has to play first-time passes, he fails time and time again. And unfortunately, as a 28-year-old playing for Manchester United, that just isn't good enough. At the moment, he still might be the best option we have in that position because we aren't blessed with many defensive midfielders. So I'm not saying drop him from the team, but when we look forward to a successful and hopefully successful Manchester United, I don't quite see how Fred can be part of that. McTominay, however, I think is a different proposition. He has his weaknesses, which we've been through, but he's improving, and that's the difference. Scott McTominay has got better year in, year out, and whilst he had a bit of a sluggish start to this year, under Rangnick, we've seen the best version of him this season. He's also younger, and I know it's only 3 years difference, but that transition from mid-20s to late 20s is huge for central midfielders. That's when you see whether they go from being a decent squad player to someone that you rely on in that first team. And if he can keep improving, I think Scott McTominay can absolutely do that. And also from the comments we've seen from Rangnick about McTominay being a potential future United captain, I don't see him going anywhere anytime soon, although maybe the captain talk is slightly premature. The problem is, with Fred, I'm not so sure. Right, give me your thoughts in the comments below. Is Fred good enough? Is McTominay good enough? Do we have to stop with this McFred nonsense where they both get sort of blended into one sort of amalgam of soup where they both look shit because one of them had a good game, one of them had a bad game? Like, the amount of times when they've both had a great game together is pretty slim. Weirdly enough, it's against Cities and PSGs and these big teams. But I think what we do by putting them together is you ignore the strengths of one, you ignore the weaknesses of another, and you eventually just end up having two players that no one thinks anything of, when really they are different players with different strengths, different weaknesses, and I think different trajectories in this team. Give me your thoughts in the comments below. What have we missed? What should we be looking for with Fred and McTominay? And can both of them get into this team under Ralph Rangnick? Thanks for watching.